the first time you get any of the edits done, you learn a staggering amount of what you've actually done on the page. And after that, you can absorb a lot of that into your own drafting. Some writers always have blind spots about particular things, but they'll get to know what they need the help with. That's the thing. I totally agree with you that you get to a stage where formal developmental edits are just not necessary if you're in a groove you know well. Where you might want to get a developmental edit if you're an experienced writer is if you're stepping outside your usual comfort zone.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Roz Morris about managing your editorial crew, including how authors can effectively manage their editing process, the role beta readers play in the development of an author's work, what the needs are for editing before submitting a work to a traditional publisher or an agent, and tips for indie authors on making the most out of your editing experiences and dollars. And now let's hear from Roz Morris about managing your editorial crew. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Roz Morris. Hey, Roz, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty. Nice to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
It is lovely to have you here as always. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Roz Morris's novels and memoir have been recognized by major mainstream awards. She's coached award-winning writers in both fiction and nonfiction, taught creative writing for the Guardian masterclasses, blogged for Writers Artists Yearbook, and been a regular judge on Litopia's pop-up submission show, critiquing manuscripts from promising writers. And Roz is also the editor-in-chief and an ambassador for the Alliance of Independent Authors. And Roz was a guest back in episode 247, Newsletter Marketing as a Creative Endeavor. And so I invited Roz back on the podcast because she and I were chatting about editing, which Roz is well equipped to talk about. And I realized that a lot of times when I hear people talk about editing in blog posts or articles or podcast interviews, it's always a very generic set of recommendations, kind of like the beginner set of recommendations. But I never really hear people talk about how do authors' editing needs change over time? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And although we don't want to spend too much time on it, Roz, I think it would be helpful just to provide context. Do you just want to give a quick overview of what you see as like the categories of editing and what each of those entails?
Yes, I'd say there are three general categories: developmental, copy editing, and proofreading. Developmental editing is when the writer has done as much as they can on their own on the book, and they need a view on whether the content works. It's not yet about fixing spellings or checking accuracy of things. That comes much later. What you first of all need to do is establish whether the book works for its market, or whether the author needs to go back, add more things, simplify some things, make things more complex for the market, all those kinds of things. That's developmental editing. That's developing the content so that it is as good as possible for the reader. And once that's done, it then goes through another stage, which is copy editing. And that's when someone goes through the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb and figures out whether there are any inconsistencies, any things that are happening that are impossible, any inaccuracies. All these kinds of things they're really easy errors to make. And that's because an author has got to invent it all from scratch. Never forget, they are inventing it all from nothing. And it's a bit like snagging on a building project. There's so much that they do from nothing. And then someone needs to come in and say, that's the wrong way around. It's that kind of thing that copy editing does. It fixes it catches little things that you didn't have time to spot because you were making something much bigger. Then when those issues have been addressed, and that may well involve the author going and tweaking some, say, the plot timeline, or doing a bit more research and changing some facts in the book because of that. After that, there's a final check, which is the proofreading stage, where someone goes through it again with a fresh eye and checks, is there anything else we haven't spotted? These will be little things, but they do slip through because, again, you've been concentrating on other things. Something that people don't realize until they start trying to publish or get published is how much checking is involved in a book manuscript. Most of what the author does is generating, it's creating. But then when you get to editing stages, that's a lot of checking. And that's what eventually produces a book that's going to really satisfy the reader and not trip them up with anything that's wrong. That's why this is all done. It's to make the reader's experience as good as possible.
Well, I'm going to describe how I've been approaching editing, because I think that my approach is probably common, and it's what I recommend to people when I'm giving introductory overviews of indie publishing, the kinds of editing that's out there. So over time, I've evolved to a scenario where I have one editor. I don't have like 3 separate people, although I'm going to caveat that in a moment. And when I send him a novel, and I'm talking specifically about fiction here, what I am primarily looking for is someone who can find the large issues and understand enough to help guide me in fixing them. And so, as an example, one of the key things that my editor has done is point out to me when he feels as if the motivation of a character is not convincing or not compelling. So that's what I'm primarily relying on him for. From the point of view of copy editing, the median level of editing, my request to him is if he finds something that's odd or like the terminology is awkward or something like that, just to point it out, like, this is weird, fix this, not fix it for me. And this is all to make his time as efficient as possible and therefore to make it as economical for me as possible. And then I'm fortunate that I have an eagle-eyed proofreader in my sister who recently retired from a job teaching graduate linguistics at Oxford University. So I'm pretty sure she's going to catch all the commas that are misplaced. And so I was using one editor plus a qualified volunteer to help me through those. And I was speaking to another author who's also very experienced. His approach was completely different. His feeling was that because he had at this point dozens of works of fiction under his belt, that he no longer needed that developmental part of editing. And this is someone who's very successful, whose books are great. So I don't think he's undermining his quality by using this approach. But it made me realize that different people have they evolve such different approaches. And I think that there are 3 things that have informed the evolution of my editing needs over time. One is that I've gotten better since 2013 when I published my first book. The second is that I've developed a more sophisticated group of beta readers that can help me out with these things. And 3, I think that the tools are just getting better. Like even Microsoft Word typo checking throws fewer false positives than it used to. Those tools are just better to find the little nitty-gritty stuff. So with all that background, can you speak based on your experience with yourself and your clients? How have you seen writers' editing needs change over time, and how do you guide them based on what you're seeing in their work?
They do change over the time. They definitely do. A writer who's on their first book, who doesn't really know what needs to be done, as I said, all the checkings that you have to do and how you have to put yourself in the reader's shoes and think what the reader wants and needs. A first-time writer doesn't know all that. But the more books you do, the more you do learn. And you can learn such a lot from editors. Usually, the first time you get any of the edits done, you learn a staggering amount of what you've actually done on the page. And after that, you can absorb a lot of that into your own drafting. Some writers always have blind spots about particular things, but they'll get to know what they need the help with. That's the thing. I totally agree with you that you get to a stage where formal developmental edits are just not necessary if you're in a groove you know well. Where you might want to get a developmental edit if you're an experienced writer is if you're stepping outside your usual comfort zone. Some of the writers who I've helped have been very experienced in, say, nonfiction, but they've been venturing into fiction. I've helped 2 New York Times bestselling writers who were very well established for nonfiction kinds of books in quite different areas, but they wanted to write novels, and that was completely new to them. So that's what I helped them with, transitioning from one medium to another. I also helped a radio drama writer transition to novels. And where you are doing something where you aren't on confident ground, that's where you might sort of go back to the beginning and find an editor who can help you make that transition. But yes, you sort of, ideally, you build up the people you need who can give you the feedback for your remaining blind spots. With my most recent novel, I had beta readers who were experts in particular fields that I needed, particular sort of factual areas of life, who would check my research and check I hadn't made any mistakes, and they made really good suggestions for ways I could accomplish something more easily. My beta readers for that book included people who were experts in those fields, but when it came to the storytelling aspects, I could just bounce ideas off other writers who would think in my way and understand what I needed. And then I could just give the book to the beta readers and they could tell me, oh, that doesn't work. And like you said with your developmental editor or your copy editor who said, this is weird, sort it out. That was all I needed. This is weird, sort it out means, oh, okay, I'll go away and I'll go into my own file of things I know go wrong and see if I can sort it out. And if I can't, well, I'll then go and ask people. So we build up what we need. To start with, we do need to learn, I think, from professionals who are very experienced in what can go wrong. But once we know what goes wrong with our way of doing things, then we're much better able to absorb that as part of our craft.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is making me realize that there are two things that one hopes one gets from an editor. One is that it's someone who can recognize where fixes are needed. And second of all, can explain it in a way that is understandable. And I think that for an early writer, having both of those things is very important. But as you become more experienced, I think the need for someone who can explain it lessens, whereas the need for someone who can see the issues continues. And so an example would be that as a writer of suspense, mystery, and thrillers, I sometimes miss opportunities to ratchet up the suspense. And so as an example, there was a scene in one of my books where the protagonist is waiting outside her godfather's house. She's seeing something going on in the house that's nefarious. She finds a way to save that situation, but not before the cops show up. And so she needs to be hiding from the cops until they leave and she can go into her godfather's house. And so that I just had, she waited behind a bush until the cops left and then she went into the house. Yeah. And my editor said, well, like, here's an opportunity where maybe, what if she runs into the cops? What if she barely misses running into the cops? You know, if she runs into the cops, it's clearly going to be a bad thing. And I was like, oh yeah, that would make sense to capitalize on this. But then I didn't need to have it explained to me how to do that. Like once it was pointed out to me that there was an opportunity I could capitalize on, I could do that myself. And so I realized that maybe there's this sort of inverse relationship between a need for someone whose entire profession is editing and someone who is a very experienced beta reader. Because if you have beta readers who are experienced in your genre, and I think that always pays to point out experienced beta readers in your genre, then they can often point out where things are going wrong, and you don't necessarily need them to point out how to fix it. Does that make sense?
Yes. And there's a big debate about whether editors should fix things or just say, not sure about this, and that will be enough. And of course, the more frequently you've worked with an editor, the more they can say, oh, you've done that again. And then you say, oh, yeah, I thought you'd say that. And that's all you need. A good editor will be able to tell from the quality of the manuscript what the writer already understands about, say, pacing or using suspense or getting as much conflict as possible, so that they'll be able to pitch what they say accordingly without having to teach you to suck eggs.
Yeah, I think that I'm seeing a follow-on episode here specific to beta readers, because what I have been fortunate to evolve is I have a set of beta readers that I solicit for each book. And I wish I could remember where I had gotten that tip, but don't just consider that you have a generic pool of beta readers and this is the group you're always going to send it out to. Always ask your pool of newsletter subscribers or whatever pool you want to be drawing from. Okay, now I have another book coming out. Does anyone want to beta read this? Because first of all, that confirms that they're available and they're interested. And it gives you a chance to maybe weed out people where the experience wasn't so great for either one of you. And I have developed that pool of people that I can draw from. And I also have gained an understanding of what their skill sets are. So I have very lucky to have a beta reader, Lisa Reagan, who's very successful in the genre I'm writing in. She's fantastic at finding those. I'm not quite buying the motivation of the characters, those really high level things. And also, one thing I appreciate is that her comments always have the note, and I think you can fix this real easily with like a paragraph or two. Because she's somebody that's in the writing biz. And so she realizes that if she makes a suggestion that's completely ripping and tearing, that's going to be painful, right through to my sister, who's excellent at finding the missing commas. And so I feed it to them in that order. Do you have advice on how people can best develop and then the care and feeding of that group of beta readers in order to serve some of the editorial needs that maybe originally they went to an editor specifically for?
Well, each beta reader demonstrates what they are good at doing and how they want to respond to your work and the kind of feedback they want to give you. So I totally agree that you end up with a team of people who will cover the bases you need and enjoying doing it too. I mean, I have people who say, I'm ready to read your next one, just let me know, which is absolutely lovely. And I know that they will give me honest and useful feedback, but they are mostly enjoying themselves as well. And that's nice. And you do need people who will be able to spot the surprising things that you missed. But you just get to know them. And the newsletter is a great way of doing it, because with the newsletter, you've got an ongoing relationship with them. Even if you don't publish a book very often, you've got an ongoing relationship, letting them know you're doing work, you're working on things. And so they still sort of feel part of your world. And I think that's very important.
One of the benefits I can see, I suppose for editors too, but specifically for beta readers, is that you might be able to combine editorial input with sort of like market research, because I always love hearing what the readers think about particular characters, especially secondary characters. All of my books are sort of like casts of characters, and I love all of them, but obviously I don't have any impartiality there. And so it's useful to hear from readers who are saying, oh, I don't really understand like why this relationship is going on, or, oh, I could read a whole book just based on this one character.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's valuable, or do you think that there's a danger in soliciting that kind of market research information with editorial input?
It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, isn't it? It is always useful to know how someone's responding to what you're writing, but you shouldn't always do exactly what a beta reader says, because they don't have the perspective that you have. I've got people who will say, I'd love a sequel about those characters, and I think there isn't a sequel. This was their story. I've got people who said, I wanted to know what happened 6 months later. 6 months later I think that should be private for the characters. So trust your gut. If somebody gives you feedback like that, it's lovely. It shows the characters are really living for them. The story's really living for them. And they want more in some way. But it's up to you to be really responsible with the story you've created and the characters you've created, and think, will I kind of burn them out, use them up too much if I give them more, for instance? So that's something you also have to be quite restrained about, leaving the reader with something that they are still chewing over and treasuring, provided they are not unsatisfied. You don't want them to think you've copped out or missed something important, but you can leave them with a feeling of, oh, I do sometimes wonder what they're doing. And that's a character who's still living for the reader. That's wonderful.
Well, who was it who said, it was probably Stephen King. Stephen King gets credited with everything, that pay attention to what your beta readers say is an issue, but don't pay attention to their comments about how to fix it. Whereas I think with a professional,
the fixing thing is important there. Beta readers often don't have the technical know-how, the craft know-how to understand what they're suggesting, but an editor knows much better about this. They will know what actually is going on under the words, the mechanisms that are working on the reader at a deeper level that the reader doesn't really understand. The beta reader gives you the impression of the final work, whereas the editor knows what's under the bonnet and how it all really works. So I'd say an editor's suggestions are worth taking seriously. Beta reader suggestions, sometimes they're brilliant. Sometimes they are exactly what you didn't see and what you need. And sometimes they're way off beam, but they are a really good indicator that something needs to be changed. But again, you might be about to say, should you always do what your editor says? Well, not necessarily. The editor might get you started in the right direction. And then you might think, no, there's actually a much better way to solve this. And again, as you get more experienced, you know what you can do with your craft, what you want to do with your art, the way you want people to feel about your characters and your books. And this applies as much to memoir as it does to fiction. So the more experience you get, the more you can be really in charge of what's going on and not derailed so much by suggestions about things that are wrong. You can actually just absorb them and still come out with something at the end that's satisfying and is entirely you.
Yeah, one of the things that I appreciate about my editor is that he's willing to sort of argue things out with me. And I don't mean in a confrontational way, but a good example of this is that I had a book set on Mount Desert Island, Maine, island off the Maine coast. And I had a scenario where two characters from very different backgrounds knew each other, had encountered each other socially. And he said, well, just take that reference out because it doesn't really make sense that these two people from very different backgrounds would have met each other. And I realized that it wasn't that it didn't make sense that they had met each other. It was that I hadn't set up the setting in a way that made it clear that it was perfectly reasonable. This is an island where the non-tourist season population is fairly small. If someone is well-known in one area and somebody else is well-known in another area, they're probably going to have run into each other at a party or something like that. And so I could have addressed his specific issue just by taking out the reference that they had met each other before, but it served the needs of the story better for me to spend a little more time describing the circumstances that enabled these characters to know each other. And I do kind of feel like if my editor's listening, he can weigh in on this, but I feel comfortable arguing with my editor about stuff like this in a way that I would not feel comfortable arguing with a beta reader. I think with a beta reader, you kind of have a responsibility just to listen to what they have to say and not sort of challenge them on it. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Beta readers probably aren't expecting to be challenged. They're probably just expecting to say their thing. And then you go away and make use of it. Editors are quite different. They are used to discussion. And that's a really interesting example that you gave there. Because my first thoughts as an editor were, he might have been thinking, that's a bit too much of a coincidence. And also maybe it's a bit cluttered. You often find the scenes that are cluttered and you take them out and somehow everything runs more smoothly. But you had the feeling it wouldn't run smoothly and actually that it would lose something important. So then you delved to find, what is the important thing here? What has everyone missed? What have I missed? And you identified it, and it sounds like a really good reason. So editors love discussions like that. It's part of the collaboration of making the book what it should be.
Yeah, I do think that there's some kind of editorial / beta reader job that someone could charge by the hour for that would just be, I just want to get on the phone with somebody or a Zoom meeting with someone and I want to talk through this because I'm fortunate to have developed a community of fellow writers I can do that with, but early on I didn't have that. And I also have to say that for those kinds of things where it's just, I think everybody's had the experience of writing out an email to my writer friend and describe this problem. And then when you're done with your email, you've answered the question yourself and you never actually have to send the email. And I am finding that AI, ChatGPT has been a great resource to me for that because I can just have a conversation. And at the end, I'm not necessarily acting on what the AI has told me, but just the process of interacting with something helps organize the thoughts in my head. And so hopefully that enables me to leave the more interesting things for the humans because I can clear out some of the things I can deal with myself using that mechanism.
Yes, and that reminds me of an exercise that I put in my Nail Your Novel books, it's something that I still do. But if I was unsure about what to do with a particular idea, I would decide 2 ways to do it. And then I would make a pros and cons list. So if I have this happen, then these are the following consequences. If I don't have this happen, these are the following consequences. So it's exactly what you're describing. It's a way of making yourself discuss it and explain it and think through it properly. There are loads of ways that we can do this. And again, as you become more practiced as a writer, you get used to asking yourself questions and figuring out what the bigger purpose of, say, a scene might be. The purpose of a scene is something that's so important. Once you understand what you're trying to achieve by having a particular story element and having it go the way it's going, that makes you very wise about what you're trying to do and about what the missing pieces might be and about how you might be muddying things without that being a good thing. So yes, those kinds of discussion, again, as we get more to understand how our own minds work, really, as creative people, we can build ways to make our own work better just by ourselves. And then that means we don't need so much concentrated expert input, especially not as much as we might have at the beginning. But then if we're writing a kind of book, as I said, that's very new to us, that's got a very different kind of audience, very different conventions, and that works on the reader in quite a different way, that's when you might need to go back to an expert to guide you to do it the new way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one of the reasons that I rely on some third parties, and I think the theme here is you need somebody other than yourself to look at it, because there's no way you can bring an impartial view to your own work. I think it's very hard to tell for the author to know, have I made the point? Have I provided the experience? Have I done too much? Have I done too little? And that's where beta readers or editors can provide that valuable third-party perspective.
Yes, they can. And as we said, it's really good to have a range of beta readers who've got different sensitivities. So there'll be some people who will love all your characters, and you think they're not going to be the ones who'll tell me if one of them isn't really working, but other ones will. So there's sort of the team together are what makes the big difference. And again, it's your own development as a writer. You are gathering the people you need, and you need to do the job better. At the beginning, you don't know at all what you need. You don't even know what most of the job consists of. But the more experienced you get, the more you can make those decisions yourself. You find the right people, you know whose advice to take on which kind of thing, whose advice to not take to heart so much because they aren't so good at those bits, but they're much better at other bits. I often think of it as a creative crew around me who are helping. We're sort of crewing the ship together, but I'm deciding where it goes.
Yeah, one of the things I realized that I would modify for my own work, and also the advice I give to people based on this conversation, is I always thought of it as there's the chunk of beta readers and there's the editor, and you do one or the other first. I've heard arguments for people giving it to an editor first or beta readers first. I think what I would do instead is understand those strengths of each of those individuals, and then slot the editor in there at some point. Like I had mentioned, my friend Lisa Reagan, who's great at giving overarching plot advice. I would always give it to her first if she's willing to read it. And then when I was done with that, I might step back and say, all the things that I was kind of feeling uncomfortable about, now I understand from an experienced expert third-party point of view. I understand those things. What more do I need? Do I need to be paying someone to take another pass at it, or have I gotten the input I need? And so the editor slots in there maybe optionally, depending on the input you're getting from other people. And obviously, you're not going to give it to the proofreader before you give it,
That's
before
really
you've had someone do a developmental edit.
I don't know if you've ever discussed this in other podcasts, but I get people writing to me saying, I've had it professionally proofread, and I'd just like you to do a developmental edit. I think, oh dear.
Yeah. Yeah, I always mention this because I've mentioned it before, but I think it's useful. That one of the things that I'm very nervous about is if I've put my work into Vellum, and Vellum is the software I use in order to format it to create the ebook and the print book copies. And if I have to go in and do anything in Vellum, I get very nervous that I've accidentally changed something. I don't find the Vellum interface particularly good for making, editing changes, because that's not what it's intended for. Mm-hmm. And so if I have to do anything other than just like adding another book to my also buy list or something, oftentimes I'll send it to one of my beta readers who's very good at proofreading, and I do the typo bounty. So I say, I'll give you $5 for every typo you find up to $50. And they're always very excited to do that. And it gives me that confidence that I haven't introduced an issue by trying to fix another issue. But yeah, that is the very, very, very last thing you want to do before you hit publish or before you send it to your publisher. And actually, that suggests another question. If people are pursuing a traditional route, what kind of editing or beta reader input do you recommend they get before they send it to an agent or an editor at a publishing house?
Well, you don't need copy editing or proofreading. That's a complete waste of time. What you should do is try to develop the content as much as possible. So developmental editing might be worthwhile if you were feeling a bit lost, or if it was your first book and you've never really had a professional eye on what you've done before. You don't know if it's up to standard. Beta readers, if you've got a sort of nice spread of different expertises, beta readers might do you quite well. I mean, a lot of people submit novels after having workshopped them, and what they get from the workshopping gives them enough of a sense of how a general reader would view the manuscript. And something else that you have to consider is that usually a literary agent or a publisher will want to do their own developmental edit as well. An agent's edit won't be very detailed. They might give you just a couple of paragraphs saying, I think you need to increase the feeling of jeopardy. And so they might give you a comment like that, but that will be a lot of work for you. They won't give you pages and pages and pages. A publisher, if they decide to take something on, will go through it in much more detail. So you are probably going to be facing quite a lot of sets of development at some stage. But again, the more experienced you already are, the less development you'll need because you already know how to do it. If you're at the beginning and you're seeking a publishing deal or a literary agent, it's far more likely that you're going to need to be developed quite a bit before your book is going to hit the right marks.
Yeah, one editorial input option that I just recently discovered or took advantage of, I guess, is in contests. So I had submitted a book to the North Street Book Prize, and I didn't win, but I did get a fabulous editorial, like a pretty extensive editorial response back. And I can't remember what the submission fee was for that prize, but whatever it was well worth having spent it just to get like a truly impartial input on it. Because I think even your editor can't be completely impartial because they're like a little bit invested in what you're doing. Whereas I think a prize judge, that's about as impartial an assessment as you can get. And it was super useful just to hear what somebody in that position had to say. So some prizes provide that. I'll point people to the Ally Awards Ratings Service for more insight into where they might be able to get those things. But that was very interesting.
Yes, contests, not all contests do this, but if you do get a contest that will give you a critique, they can be very useful. And even if all they write is one paragraph, it might highlight something that you hadn't seen discussed before about your work. It's always worth seeing what people say about it, even if you decide, oh, I don't think they were quite the right person. Or you might think, no, I would really like that to be the right person for my book. So now what do I do in order to get there?
Yeah. So, Roz, I'm wondering if you have a couple of red flags that you would advise writers look out for that maybe suggests that the editorial approach they're taking is no longer serving them. Like maybe they're still pursuing an approach that, was good for them 10 books ago or 5 books ago or something like that. Do you see flags for those kind of disconnects that make you recommend that people should try something different?
That's a really difficult question because I think people become very good at knowing what they need and where they would be best spending their budgets. Mm-hmm. Often I find people change editors. And so the new editor it's just a completely different brain who's going to see things in a different way. And that might be exactly what you want, or it might not. And I'm seeing it from the editor's point of view, I'm afraid as well. I'm thinking, how am I going to do a good job for this person? Are they going to understand what I'm saying? Is my take going to be what they need? So I'm always thinking how I can help them make the book they want to make while sort of being professional and say, well, that needs to be changed. That needs to, giving tough love when needed. Really, writers work it out for themselves because, think of it, we are self-starting people. We're creative people. We know when we need the value someone is adding, and we know when actually we don't need to pay for such an intensive kind of edit. We can get away with what we've now learned, but we're doing quite well with that. But so long as you do get other eyes on it, and you said that earlier as well, the thing you really need is good feedback from people who can explain how they're feeling about what you've written and how they are responding to it. And if you know what to do about that, or you know where to find out what to do about that, then you're more capable of taking matters into your own hands rather than giving the manuscript to a developmental editor and saying, please tell me what to do about everything. You just get to the stage where you don't need that. And that's quite normal with writers in traditional publishing as well. They get to the stage where their editors know, when I get that manuscript in from them, it's going to be pretty clean. It won't need very much work. And everyone knows that. It's just a natural level of capability that develops as you get better at your craft.
Yeah, and I think that the needs change over time. You become more sophisticated, the needs change over time. One of the things I was thinking is that just as I recommend that if authors find a book cover in their genre that they really like, to make a note of who the book cover designer is, so that, if you're ever looking for a new designer, you're looking for your first designer, you have kind of a pool of people you can follow up with. Maybe people should be doing the same for editors, because I think that the other thing that changes over time is that people might have more money to invest in editing. And so when they're writing their first book and they don't have any income from previous books, maybe they have to make a decision more based on economy than they do later on. And so there could be this sort of arc where it is you're getting more editorial work because now you're in a position to pay for a more sophisticated input or whatever that might be, a more experienced editor. And then eventually it does tail off because you yourself have learned enough in order to bring that editorial perspective to your own work.
Also, they might feel they want to push themselves more. They might think, I think I've got more in me if I could find someone who would help bring it out.
Yeah, that is actually, I guess, another red flag question would be, when should people consider switching their editor? What would be a sign that maybe the editor that you're working with now is not the right person for you?
Well, it's all about the relationship, isn't it? It's how much the writer trusts what the editor is saying. If you find you're thinking, no, they always say that and I never agree, that's a sign that you've maybe outgrown that editor and should look for somebody else. If the relationship continues to be useful and positive and you're all wanting the same thing and you're both genuine and engaged with making it the best book, all is well. If you're starting to think any of those elements are missing, then maybe it's time to pull away. Now, maybe you don't need another editor. Maybe you need just different beta readers, and they might help you figure out what to look for in another editor if you decide to go back to developmental editing. Like you said, you don't need developmental editing forever. It's a learning process being developmentally edited. You learn to write the books you want to write through a developmental editor. And it might be that you always want to have a developmental editor who will look over it. Or it might be that you get to the stage where you think, I kind of know what I'm doing, trust myself. I can do it, like you said, with your editor just has to say, sort out that weird bit. And that's all you need. So it's very much a sort of give and take process.
So great. Well, Roz, as always, it's lovely to chat with you. I know every time we have a conversation, I have some light bulb moment myself. And so thank you for another one of those light bulb moments. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
You can find me at my website, which is rozmorris.org. And I'm ROZMORRIS.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Roz. How have your editing needs evolved over time as a writer? Do you rely more on beta readers or editors, and why? I would love to hear about it. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And I also wanted to mention a great companion episode to this one, episode 88, How to Receive and Give Critique with Tiffany Yates Martin. And if you got value from this episode or any episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.